There are a lot of campaign settings out there for various tabletop RPG role-playing games. I mean, like, a lot. And that's not counting all of the homebrew worlds for all of those various systems. Now, many of these worlds are seemingly tied to a particular system, but do they have to be? So, for example, Forgotten Realms with Dungeons and Dragons, but for good or bad, it's evolved over the editions of D&D to work with the latest rule set. So in a way, the Forgotten Realms has adapted to other systems of Dungeons and Dragons. The reason I bring all of this up is I was listening to a podcast called Manifest Zone, which is a podcast all about the world of Eberron, and Keith Baker mentioned in it that he was playing an Eberron game, but using the Savage Worlds RPG system. And it shouldn't have, but it kind of blew my mind. And now, if you love a setting, like if you love Eberron more than anything, you know the lore, and then you have all this knowledge about it, and you want to try a new system, it seems like a no-brainer to just run the setting you know with the system you don't know. So it got me thinking, like, what other systems could I play a Dungeons and Dragons established world in, or what other settings could be brought into Dungeons and Dragons as a rule set? And speaking of campaign settings, this video is sponsored by Metis Creative and their Kickstarter Historica, Arcanum, Empires of the Silk Road, an alternate history universe where arcane secrets lie just beyond the veil of mortal eyes. This setting is massive and detailed, obviously written with love and passion by an incredible team out of Istanbul, Turkey. The setting is for 5e with 2 source books, player options, an adventure, and a soundtrack suite composed for the campaign. It really is an incredible addition to your collection. Check out Historica, Arcanum, Empires of the Silk Road today by clicking on the link in the description, and thanks again, Metis Creative. Hello everybody, Jordan here. The PH is silent. I brainstormed a lot when making this video, just this topic alone, and there are a lot of settings that fit a particular system, but they wouldn't work with another system. So you could probably adapt the Forgotten Realms to play in any sword and sorcery game with minimal effort. I'd love to play a Faerun game using Dungeon Crawl Classics or Old School Essentials, but those kind of make sense because they're D&D adjacent. And I wonder how different it would really feel, with Dungeon Crawl Classics being an adaptation of 3.5 and Old School Essentials just being old D&D. It has all of the things that I need to have a Forgotten Realms game. But what about a Powered by the Apocalypse game like Dungeon World, which has all of those fantasy tropes, but it's a very different system than the roll over D20. And I don't know. I've never tried it. I'm very curious though. You probably wouldn't use a fantasy-based tabletop RPG to play in a science fiction setting. It would take heavy alterations to use the current edition of Dungeons & Dragons to play in the world of Alien. And I see this in a lot of homebrew for D&D because they're familiar with 5e mechanics. People want to use those mechanics to run a superhero game or a hard science fiction game. And it can work because at the end of the day, I think we're just rolling dice, but will it be as effective as playing a system kind of designed around superheroes or around science fiction? And this is just kind of a play blank game instead of D&D argument, which I'm not a fan of that argument. It seems to imply that D&D is bad at being a game, which it's not. There has been this idea that there's this like one unified perfect system out there that we could obtain if we just tried hard enough. But I don't think that there is, because the perfect system is subjective. There's a reason the world hasn't dropped everything to play Fate. Yes, you can play anything in Fate, but no, I don't want to play Fate. Plus, there is something special when a setting and the mechanics of the game combine into a really great tabletop RPG role-playing game. Call of Cthulhu, I feel, is a good example of this. The mechanics created really fit the setting. Numenra is also a solid example where the system and the setting were combined, but then the setting kind of broke off and became its own self. Now you have the Cypher system, which you could play just about anything with, from fantasy westerns to superheroes. So I casually asked on Twitter and YouTube, what fictional worlds would you like to play a tabletop RPG game in? And lots of responses, like a lot of responses. Oftentimes consuming shows, comics, books, we know those worlds better than a published game world. It's probably one of the reasons that Wizards of the Coast was trying to have novels set in the Forgotten Realms, just so people knew about what the world was all about. And so watching the Marvel movies, without prior knowledge, I bet that you could run a superhero game set in the MCU with minimal effort. Players would jump in too because they're familiar with the world. Now, many of these people in the tweets and on YouTube, they would give recommendations on systems that they would effectively run these non-tabletop RPG worlds with. Is the future of role-playing games a system that lets you play in a established world, or a system that lets you play with the feeling of that world? So for example, I don't want to play in the Alien universe, but I do want an alien horror space style game to get that feeling. And I think a lot of us like that adjacent feeling. I don't necessarily want to play the X-Files in Dungeons & Dragons 5e, but I do like the idea of creating a character whose mission is to discover the truth of spelljamming. And that character could be an anthropomorphic fox. New character idea, a fox named Mulder that is trying to prove the existence of spelljamming. So let's ask the question, what would a Forgotten Realms game look like using something I'm familiar with, Dungeon Crawl Classics? I haven't ran anything like that specifically, but I'm curious to. Now, I have access to maps, NPCs, a huge world that I'm already familiar with, and on the DCC side, I have spell levels, medieval weapons, and compatible monsters because it was a break from Dungeons & Dragons 3.5. Now, the system would make Faerun feel different, and I think that's what excites me about it. But also, what about running the Forgotten Realms with the Forbidden Land system? Although I have yet to run Forbidden Lands, I want to now call this adventure Forbidden Realms or Forgotten Lands. The heart of this is when I was thinking about Eberron and how Keith Baker was running Eberron with Savage Worlds, and I was thinking about running an Eberron game, but incorporating one of the books that Monte Cook Games put out for 5e about adapting Numenra stuff into 5e. This book's called Arcanum of the Ancients, and it's really good. Then I was thinking, what would a Eberron game look like using the Numenra rule set? And in a way, I think Eberron might work better for Numenra than it would for D&D. As I was reading Arcana of the Ancients, trying to adapt that into my 5e game, I just kept thinking, what if we just adapt the Eberron lore parts that I want into an already existing Numenera system? Your homebrew D&D world doesn't necessarily have to be tied to just D&D. And I like that. So the more that I am into tabletop role-playing settings, I seem to enjoy system-neutral source books the most. Usually, all of the puzzles and exploration can work in just about any system, and all I need to do is convert monsters into a 5e equivalent or a Dungeon Crawl Classics equivalent or a whatever equivalent. And that's not as difficult as it sounds. One of the best tricks that a lot of dungeon masters pull is what I call putting funny hats on top of monsters. And what I mean by that is taking a monster like a troll and calling it a Shoggoth from Lovecraft and modifying a few tags to make it work. If you've been following the channel for a bit, then you'll know that one of my favorite things to do in D&D 5e is to run older adventures with this latest system. So specifically, I ran a 2e adventure called Rod of Seven Parts, but I set it in the Forgotten Realms. And the biggest thing I needed to do when running that was to figure out how the rod works with 5e mechanics. And honestly, after that, I picked appropriate monsters for my players, and I let them direct the campaign as they searched for the rod fragments. Now, you can check that out over on Nerd Immersion's Play channel. I have a playlist on this channel too. It's also a podcast on my Patreon, and it was great. We had a blast. It was so much fun that the same crew is coming back for another 2e game called The Great Modron March that we're going to stream. It will be 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. My players are returning as their same characters from the Rod of Seven Parts game, which is level 12, and I'll be altering the adventure as we go to fulfill the story and the heart of the adventure as I see it, but I'll probably put my own twist on it here and there. And the work that I really need to do for this adventure, for this challenge, is to find monsters, put funny hats on them, and fit them into the campaign. And it's a lot easier than you think. Thinking about specific settings and how they wouldn't work for certain things, I don't think I would run a Call of Cthulhu game using D&D 5e where everybody feels kind of like a superhero. It wouldn't have the same feeling of Call of Cthulhu. And thinking about it, I really want to run a game using the movie Dark City as an inspiration, which you should go watch Dark City. It's a city forever in darkness with no escape, and it seems perfect for the Call of Cthulhu system, even though I might not include a Lovecraftian mythos. The Matrix, the first movie, it was amazing. And what if you wanted to run a Matrix-style game in a tabletop role-playing game? Your player characters start to realize that the world is not what they think. And the more I think about this, I want to run City of Mist, which is an urban fantasy neo-noir detective tabletop game that I think would work really well. Now, I haven't played City of Mist, but after reading a bit, I would love to run a Matrix game with that system. Diablo. I want to throw in a D&D scenario because I like to play that system and I think it's very adaptable. So using some of the Ravenloft rules, I think playing in the world of Diablo could totally work. Bring back Deckard Cain and stay a while.
Stay a while and listen.
Masks, a new generation, but in My Hero Academia. Being inspired by a property and universe is really fun. I mean, if Critical Role can run a Hogwarts-adjacent Dungeons & Dragons game, I think we're only really limited by our creativity. Thanks for watching, everyone. Check out Historica Arcanum, Empires of the Silk Road today by clicking the link in the description. It really does look like a great setting. A setting for 5e, but as we've discussed, you could probably use it for all of your tabletop role-playing systems. Do you have a hilarious system and setting merge? Have you combined Doctor Who with My Little Pony? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you all in the next video.